Hi everyone, this is Vivian. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how to customize your journal cover with embossing powder. I'll be using these Emboss It pen from Ranger and also 3 different colors of embossing powder. One is gold, one is black, and this one is a clear one. And with embossing powder, you also need to have a heat gun to melt the embossing powder. So essentially how embossing works is that you would draw your design with the ink that's slow drying, and that's what these Emboss It pens are. They're filled with ink that dries slowly. So while the ink is still wet on the surface, you dust over the embossing powder and then you shake off or shake off the rest, and then leave the design with the embossing powder stick on it, and then you apply heat to the area. And then when the embossing powder melts, it creates a permanent bond to the surface. So let's do some quick demonstration on how that works. With the Ranger Emboss It pen, it comes with the clear and the black. They do the same thing except that one is clear ink. You can barely see. And the other is black. Now these inks they look normal, but the thing is that they are slow drying, so you can have time to draw out your design and then dust the powder off. And obviously, when you have a clear ink, it's hard to tell. It's hard to see what you have drawn. So whenever possible, you might want to use the black one because then you see what you're doing. But then there are cases where if your embossing powder is going to be a lighter color, or you actually want to do using a clear embossing powder, then you might not want to use the black. So I'm going to show you the difference result of these two. Now I have the written word in clear and black. I'm going to dust over the clear powder. So while you're working on embossing powder, you might also want to have just a scrap piece of paper underneath to catch any embossing powder, because it does get messy. And you want to deliberately dust the powder all over the writing. And now it's time to use the heat gun. So with the heat gun, it's not the same as a blow dryer. Blow dryer blows out a lot of air, so you don't want that because then you're gonna blow over the powder everywhere, then it's not gonna work. So with the heat gun, it doesn't have much air. There's still air, but I'm not gonna turn it on because it's very loud. There's some air, but not too much, because it's otherwise it would just be a heater. So there's some air, and you want to turn it on for a couple seconds until it gets ready and hot. And when you heating over your embossing powder, you want to have maybe 2-inch distance. If you're too close, you're gonna burn the powder too much. It's gonna bubble up, and it might even burn the paper or whatever surface you're working on. So leave about 2-inch, and then you want to work slowly across. So now I'm going to turn on the heat gun. It's going to be a little loud. You might not hear what I'm saying, but as I said, you want to keep about 2-inch from the surface and then move it slowly across the design. You want to move when you see the powder melt. You can see the changing in the texture. Okay, now it's hot. Okay, so now we can see that with the area when the embossing powder melts, you can see it creates, this is like a ghost embossing, and then the black has a raised embossing shine to it. So this is what the clear embossing powder does. I'm going to do the same thing on the color paper. So now as you can see, even though it's a clear embossing, but when you do it on a color paper, it gives like a darker shade. It's a nice effect and it works on any color paper. If you're just going to freehand write your design and then do the embossing, then all you need is the embosser pen, the embossing powder, and the heat gun. Let's say if you have a design that you want to transfer onto the cover, in this case my Moleskine journal cover, you might be intimidated to just freehand draw your lettering on it. So I'm going to show you a few ways to transfer your design onto a cover. Let's say if I have a design that I want to transfer onto this color paper. Of course, you can simply write out your design here and then just rewrite it again with your embosser pen. But then the thing with sometimes is when you are designing, when you're just drawing here, you make a mistake and then you want to erase it. So you might be doing too much erasing and then redrawing on this paper. So I would suggest you have the design ready on a piece of tracing paper. That way you can align your design to center, to position where you want it. And then in this case, if it's a color that's not too dark, like a black or brown, you can simply just trace it over with a pencil, but then apply some pressure. So as you apply pressure to it, you are making an impression on this piece of paper. So you can later on come back with your embosser pen and then write over that impression. So that's one way you can do it. And the second way you can, if you want a more clear transfer, you can take a pencil or charcoal and then on the back side of your tracing paper, you color with your pencil. That way it has a layer of graphite. And then when we write over this design, you will get a transfer with the pencil, the graphite. Then you can go over again with your embosser pen, either the black one or the clear one, and then do the powder afterward. If you want to design something on the darker paper, like a black cover or a brown, this envelope, this paper is really dark, then the first method might be, the impression might still work, but it would be a little hard to tell because it's so dark. And then if we're using the pencil, it's still hard to tell because it's just kind of dark. So in that case, then we can do a reverse one. I have this another design, not really design, it's just a word. And I have a piece of chalk. This is just a regular chalk. And I'm going to do the same thing I did with the graphite, but this time with the chalk. So now I have chalk on the back side of this tracing paper. I'm gonna flip it over. And this time, when I write it, trace it over again with the pencil, applying some pressure as I write. You see a white transfer, and then you can go back with your embosser pen to write over your design. Another thing is there are two embosser pen, one is a clear and one is black. They work the same way, except if your embossing powder is going to be a lighter color, then you don't want to use a black pen because it might show through. And if you're using a black embossing powder on a lighter surface, say if I use this one on a pink envelope, if I want to have a black embossing, then I might want to use the black pen because in the area that the embossing powder didn't stick as well, it won't show that much because the writing is also in black. So let's go ahead and make some customized journal cover with this heat embossing technique. So here I have a Moleskine Cahier journal. It's a soft cover journal in craft color. So I'm going to use the impression technique since it's just paper cover, so I can just use a regular ball pen to trace it over while applying pressure there, and then I can just trace over the impression. So obviously, if you are confident, you can also just draw your design on the cover directly. But I usually like to make sure I have the layout, decided, and then instead of just drawing directly on the cover, because I might change my mind and then erase and then change the design and then just do too much erasing and redrawing on the cover. But if your design is simple enough, if it's just one word or two words, then definitely you can just draw directly on the cover. So while you're drawing, make sure you're actually apply enough pressure that you get an impression on the cover itself. Now that I have made the impression on the cover, it's probably a little bit hard to see on the screen, but I can see it pretty good. So I'm going to trace it over with the black Emboss It pen because I want to do the embossing in black. So now we're ready for embossing powders, and before I do that, I'm going to put an extra sheet of paper underneath just to catch the powders. And while we dust over the embossing powder, we want to be very liberal and generous while we pour over our designs. So cover the whole area with a embossing powder, and I think that's why they sell it in such a big bottle, because then you can really make sure all the areas are covered. And while you're doing this, make sure there's no running fans or your window's not open or you don't have food nearby and you don't want to be breathing heavily because you do not want to inhale this. I'm pretty sure these are not edible, so make sure you're not breathing heavily and inhale the powders. And when we dump off the excess, you can see, areas that didn't quite catch all the powder. So just go over to where you see they still need a second dusting. So we're tapping off more excess powders, and you might see areas that still have powders remaining on the surface on the places that you don't want to have the powder. So you can just use the old brush to clean off those areas. And before we turn on the heat gun, let's just put this powder back to its jar. Now we're ready for the heat gun. So before you turn it on, there are a few things to note. Is first, you don't have to be super close to the design, and second is that you want to move slowly. You want to only move across the surface when you see the texture change. When you see the embossing powder to start to melt, you will see the difference. So move slowly and then don't be too close. And then here I'm using the clear Emboss It pen and clear embossing powder to just add some embellishment. That's it for this one. It's a really nice black shine and it has a nice bump. I really like it. Now for the second cover, I'm going to use this Moleskine Softcover journal. And I'm just going to get the rubber band out of the way, and I'm going to do the same design, but because this time it's a soft cover, it's going to be hard to actually get an impression by using the first technique. So what I'm going to do is to do the graphite technique. So here I'm just covering the back side of the tracing paper with pencil marks or with graphite, or just color all over it. And then I turn it over, positioning it on the cover, and I'm just tracing over with the pencil to transfer that graphite onto the cover. So now I have this faint transfer of this design. It's good enough for me to just trace it over again with the Emboss It pen. And then again, I'm using the black embossing powder and dust very liberally all over the design. And then the same thing, remove the excess and then apply the heat. And this time I'm going to use the clear Emboss It pen to draw the embellishment, but I'm going to use the gold powder just for a different look. So there you have it, an embossed softcover Moleskine journal. So for the third cover, I am going to use this Moleskine black hardcover sketchbook, and I'm going to do a different design. This is designs from my last video. If you're interested in it, don't forget to check it out. I'm going to transfer this design on this black cover. It's going to be tricky because it's black cover. So I'm going to use this white chalk method where I just color the back side of the design and then trace it over again on the cover so I can get that white transfer of the design. So here I have a pretty good impression of the design. It's not super detailed, but it's good enough for me to just go over and trace it again. I think I'm going to use a gold embossing powder, so here it doesn't matter if I use the clear Emboss It pen or the black one, but I'm going to use the clear one here. And like I said, I'm going to use the gold embossing powder. And the same thing, you dust it all over generously and then just remove the excess and then apply heat onto the gold embossing powder. After the embossing powder is set, you can just use a paper towel to wipe off the chalk. So here are my 3 customized journal cover with heat embossing technique. I hope you give it a try. It's really fun, especially if you want to make something unique for yourself or as a gift. I hope you find this video helpful and don't forget to give it a thumbs up. All the material used in this videos are linked in the description box, and don't forget to come back next week for more tips and tricks on calligraphy and hand lettering.